There you go.
Perfect. All right, it is 12:16, so a little bit late. Going to get started here. So we'll be talking quite a bit about CSS naming conventions, what we call things, how we name them, stuff like that. It's going to be a little bit technical, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to write them down. I'll try and save some time at the end. It will be a bit technical, so if anyone is finding themselves halfway into this, questioning the previous decisions that they've made, leading them to be in this room or this hangout, feel free to leave and I won't be offended. So, without further ado, I'm just going to share my slides here and get going. And everyone, you can see this? We're all good? All right, so I'll be talking about CSS naming, a strategy for class naming and such. I should also point out that I don't have the chat open, so if anyone puts anything in there, I'm not going to see it. So, I'm just going to close this door 1 second.
Got it.
Distracting.
So people should shout out things, or just wait till the end?
Yeah, just wait till the end if you have any questions. I'll try and make sure I save some time at the end. So, let's going to dive right into it and talk a little bit about the problem that we are trying to address here. So, this is a highly accurate depiction of the experience of someone trying to write CSS. You write part of it in one spot, messes up something in another spot, you fix that spot, breaks the first spot. If you've written CSS, you've experienced this many a time. I mean, this is a result of, this is the cascade in action, what Peter is experiencing, which is the best and the worst thing about CSS. You can write CSS in one place, it'll coalesce with all the CSS you've written and all merge into this one spot, which can be your friend or your enemy, and we want it to be your friend and not the blinds here. So more specifically, what problem are we trying to address here? More than ever before, we're working on some really large sites, and we need a strategy for how we approach these, so that that we can maintain quality, we can develop these sites and not lose our minds. Right now, strategy for, what are we doing? Browser-based slides. Right now, our current strategy for naming things, and really project architecture, project architecture is largely preference-based, project per project. So depending on who the actual developer is on the site could end up looking wildly different. When you open up the project that I wrote, you're probably going to guess that I wrote it because it has my preferences all over it, which is a bit of a problem because when someone else has to jump in on a project that I wrote, they need to familiarize themselves with the code, figure out what everything does, where it was defined, what they can reuse, if they need to write new features. It's going to take a little bit of time to really get up to speed on it. As a result of that, a lot of our code is really difficult to maintain. When you jump in on a project, you really are spending quite a bit of time, and you might not even ever get to that spot of really getting what's going on. So this creates a lot of difficulty for us. The other issue is that naming things is infamously difficult. Everyone has difficulty naming things. So if we can come up with some sort of strategy that helps us out here, that'll go a long way. We also have room to grow with how we write our code. Miriam gave me a pointer that I had an error on this slide, and apparently I only fixed it in one spot. So. But anyway, this isn't anyone's code in specific. None of the examples here are anyone's code in specific. But this is the kind of thing that anyone writes when they start getting into preprocessors, or even years into using preprocessors. This is something that I see on code reviews quite often. This is code, stuff code like that I've written in the past. There are a few issues with this. There's way too much specificity here. So we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but combined, we have quite a lot of specificity. To override any of this is going to be really difficult. We don't actually want that. This code is written just to represent the DOM structure, which isn't a particularly useful strategy. Or necessary, right? So we know the DOM structure. We don't need to reflect that somewhere else. I don't know where any of these classes are defined by looking at them. So if I'm going to maintain any of this, I'm going to be really confused. If I want to write new features, I don't know what I can use from this. And if I need to edit this in any way, and I didn't write it myself, I'm going to have issues. Here's another example, which doesn't look as frightening at first, but we have similar. What's it on Evernote? I think there's a weird shortcut for Evernote. Every time oh God, this browser-based slide thing, I'm questioning some decisions that I've made. Here, I'm just going to close Evernote right now. Sorry about this. Hide button. Maybe that'll help me. Yes. Nope. Well, you guys are going to see Evernote quite a bit. Thanks, Evernote. So the issue with this particular example is that both our banner and our banner has a class of reverse. I don't know what reverse is. I don't know if it's part of my banner module or if it's a utility or if it's from a library. I know nothing about it from looking at it aside from that it exists. Also, the button and the banner both have a class of large. Similarly, I don't know if large is a variation of button and banner, is a utility. Banner's not really helping me out any. The other problem is that we kind of want to up our game. I think all of our teams here are pretty aspirational, and we're constantly looking at how things are done and ways to improve. So we have a bit of an opportunity here to grow. Specifically, we want to get rid of nesting, reflecting the DOM structure. We want to stop arming specificity wars, so not creating more specific CSS than we need to. We want to reduce the wild differences between projects because, it could be a room for personal expression, but at the same time, it makes collaboration a lot more difficult.
Not a good place for personal expression.
No. Yeah, you can take up painting. Painting's really great. There are wild inconsistencies as well. So just because something is called one thing on one project or architected in one way on one project doesn't mean that we can learn much about that. We can't reuse our own code, which is a bummer because we solve a lot of problems the exact same way over and over again. And quite literally, we can't reuse our own code, as in I can't reuse my own code that I wrote on a previous project because 6 months later I'm going to forget what it does just because the strategy is a little bit confusing. And we have some really big projects that become really unruly because we just kind of go at it and don't have a map. There are also a lot of different ways to name things, so this isn't a clearly solved problem. We can just go freestyle, kind of write it as you go. The interpretive dance of style sheets. There's object-oriented CSS, scalable and modular architecture for CSS. There's BEM. There are a lot of different ways to approach this. So which one is the best? It's hard to know for sure. You also have things like camel case versus underscores versus dashes. There are a lot of different ways to solve this problem, and we definitely have a need for a larger strategy. Some sort of standard for this that we can reproduce. That is what we need. So a few things about a strategy that would be nice. So some criteria here. I mentioned reuse. We want something that really facilitates reuse. Encapsulation means that all your code is self-contained, so that way you don't need really complicated selectors like I showed earlier. You can write much simpler code and more reusable code because it's less dependent. upon this spider web of contingencies. I mentioned naming things is really hard. You have to think about naming quite a bit. Often I find naming is a bottleneck for myself, so we want something that'll give us a little bit of help there. This is a big one. So intelligently structure large and complex projects. We work on some really big projects, and we need a way to structure our code that makes a lot of sense for these huge projects, but also we'll work with single page landing page sites. We need the same solution for both, so we can effortlessly transition between a large project or a small project. We need something that offers us a lot of clarity, something where I can look at code, know what it is doing, what I can use, if I'm going to reuse this, what do I need? So the scalable, that kind of ties in with the intelligent structure. Transparency and clarity, similar. It needs to be self-documenting to an extent. I need to be able to look at my code, know what it's going to do. And something that's going to help us raise our level of quality. And increase collaboration by making it a lot easier for me to jump in on someone else's project, and vice versa. And kind of look at what's going on in the industry, coming up with sort of the best practices. We want to leverage a lot of that. And we want to get away from some silly practices like styling based on IDs. It's 2015. What are we doing with IDs? We should kill them with fire, as they say. And another overarching kind of criteria for this is we want to place utility over preference as much as possible. And we'll see as we go that some of my long-standing preferences for code style have gone out the window, which has been an adjustment for myself. Anyway, so before we kind of tie ourselves setting strategy, we kind of want to look around at what is available to us already. What are people doing? Sort of emerging from the cowboy Wild West approach of CSS is object-oriented CSS, pioneered by Nicole Sullivan. She famously went into Facebook and reduced the size of their CSS code base by a huge amount. And this is what some object-oriented CSS looks like. This entire code block is contained within a single class, which is really nice because it's a little bit more modular. She advocates for styling based entirely on, or as much as possible, on classes instead of element names. So coming from IDs and nesting based on the DOM structure, this is improvement for sure. But it isn't entirely clear, right? We have a lot of single classes that all seem to be telling us something, but it's a little bit hard to discern what exactly. In this previous example, we have media. We have this other thing called BD, which, what is that? Like, I have no idea from looking at that. I'm going to have to look at some documentation to know what a BD is. I don't know if that's part of the media module or something else. We also need 2 levels of specificity at all times here. I need to style media space BD. I'm dependent on that. There's also a lot of this sort of direct child stuff going on. So there's definitely room to grow here. This is improvement for sure. This is progress. But there's room to grow, which we see in SMACS, Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS, pioneered by Jonathan Snook. So this takes a lot of the object-oriented CSS principles and improves upon them in some really important ways. So everything is still self-contained within a class, which makes it more contained, more conducive to reuse and such. But we also have a clear relationship between a module and an element contained within that module. So looking at this code, I can tell that I have a module called field, or fold. And I have two elements in there, a fold name and fold items. So, I've got some information that I can go on. This is definitely an improvement.
I assumed that was folder actually the first time that I saw it instead of field.
Field, folder, field. Yeah, it's folder, I guess. Fold. There's some improvement to be made with the actual naming, which I'll get to for sure. But this is great because I can style an element within a module with only one level of specificity. I can have a declaration block with only full name on it, and I can style that. So encapsulation is really great. We're not styling based on element names either, which is great because we can change our markup while maintaining our style sheets. So this is a lot more flexible. As well as that, Snook also introduced this sort of 5-bucket structure for organizing our CSS. The first one, base, is unclassed element names. So what does an H3 look like without a class attached to it? That's base. And this comes kind of after your reset, just some baseline stuff. It separates layout, how the page looks. Modules are these atomic elements. State would be things like a collapsed element, expanded, hidden, or if it has something. So a layout could have a sidebar. That's a state that a specific layout has. Or a theme. And he prefixes this stuff with a few namespace prefixes: L for layout, U for utility, T for theme. And so what this gives us is building on top of that kind of encapsulation and that he promotes. We also have this other sort of self-documenting element where we know we can have classes outside of a module, and we can know exactly where they belong just by looking at them. An earlier example, that banner large, that could be, if that was a utility function perhaps, that would be an example of that. State prefixes, I mentioned that he has a category for state. The prefix is used to indicate that. So again, I can look at my markup, and I can know exactly what each class is doing. So is a common one, is active, is animating, has sidebar, has mobile nav, something like that. I've added to that kind of in my own use of this, the can state. So it's useful for binding animations that I only want to happen at a certain point and did. So those have been particularly useful. Although not part of core SMAX, community has kind of added as well a sort of a JS prefix, kind of borrowing on this namespace prefix concept. And what this gives us is something that is not a styling class specifically for binding JavaScript, which means that if I have a search toggle attached to this toggler, I can move that class to something else on the page, and I can open up my search for any element. So I'm separating my JavaScript binding from my styles. So this isn't core SMAX, but it's kind of become a canonical part of it. So SMAX is awesome. It's huge. It's a huge improvement over anything that has existed previously, but there are a few issues with it. It doesn't deal with module variations particularly well. I mentioned that a child element within a module is indicated with a dash. So you saw that with your food. Actually, I'm not going to go back. But our folder one. And so a variation of a module is typically indicated in the same way. So there's no clear way of discerning a submodule from an element within a module, which is a bit of a problem. We tend to have modules with 5 or 6 variations, not uncommon, and a dozen, 2 dozen things nested within those modules. We want to know what's what.
Can you give one more example of that? I don't know if I caught that.
Maybe. Okay, I'm gonna scroll all the way back then. So not scroll back. Okay, so here I've got my FLD module,
yep.
And then folder name is indicated with FLD-name. If you have a variation of this module, the practice is to add a class of the module dash the variation name. So if it was like special, it would be FLV/special dash special, and that would be added to the yeah. So there's no clear way of discerning what that is, right? If that's a variation or if that is a child element. And if that variation is on a child element, it becomes really confusing.
Gotcha.
Say I want to reuse that. I don't know which classes I'm going to need and which ones I can leave behind.
Cool.
So that's the first issue with smacks. Sometimes, though, I've seen code where they don't do that. They just use a single class, which is even more confusing because it looks like another module entirely. Right? These classes are just random classes attached to elements to achieve something. I mean, looking at that later, I don't know where that class came from, where what it's designed to do. There's also this object component and also module distinction within smacks. Nobody knows what this means. I don't even think, no, Jonathan Snook definitely knows what it means. And I've read blog posts from people that definitely seem as though they know what it means. It's really confusing. So there are a few concepts like that that are really ambiguous. Child element being indicated with a dash, as well as a space indicated with a dash, is particularly confusing. I don't know if my module is called block and name is a descendant, and then child a descendant of that, or if my block is called block name, because there's nothing that's specifically for indicating that and nothing else. He also advocates for styling based on IDs despite offering an L- prefix for layout. So, I mean, that's just kind of silly. We want to get away from IDs as much as we can because they create more specificity than we need. And some modules are indistinguishable from child elements, which I already mentioned. But so that's smacks. Huge improvement. A lot of really great stuff in smacks. Some room for improvement as well. The next style we look at is called BEM, stands for Block Element Modifier, which was invented by Yandex, large search engine in Russia. BEM is actually a way larger system than just CSS. It comprises a JavaScript thing, a page builder, all sorts of stuff is included within BEM. Really big tool. The CSS naming convention stuff has kind of been abstracted from BEM, and when people talk about BEM, they usually just mean the CSS naming convention part of it, which originally looked like this. You've got a B prefix for block, block name with a dash for a space, a dedicated double underline to indicate an element, and another underline to indicate a modifier. But more often, you'll see it in this form. This is kind of the evolution of that previous one. Since almost everything on your page is going to be an element, module, so this block module, the module and block are almost interchangeable in BEM. They dropped the prefix and then got a dedicated double dash for modifier. And the cool thing about this is we have one thing on the page that indicates an element, one thing on the page that indicates a modifier, and those particular indications are only used for that. So I can plant and I immediately know what's a block, what's a modifier, what's an element. And so it provides a lot more clarity. Here's an example from the BEM site, kind of indicating a module with a few items within it. So you have the module name, double underscore the item name. So I know immediately where those classes belong. Here's an example with variations. So the hello module, this is a simple variation, and then the last item has a special modifier. Whereas if I just had a single class of simple and special, I wouldn't know where they belonged. Now I know that that simple is a modifier of the hello module, and special is a modifier of the item element within the block module. Here's another example of this syntax, just because it's a little bit weird to get used to. So the block, the element within the block, the modifier with the double dash. You have a person, a hand is a part of a person. Female is a variation on a person. Left is a variation of the hand, which is part of the person. We swallowed the fly. So that's the syntax in a nutshell. Again, it kind of it traveled a little bit from the original version of this, but it's a lot more scannable. Anyway, that's what BEM looks like, which usually people react this way. This is pretty ugly. Granted, this is probably as ugly as a naming convention can get. There's all sorts of weird stuff going on. It's pretty weird looking, but it conveys a lot of information. So clear delineation of block and modifier names. Block names are super clear. There's only one thing that looks like the block. There's none of those characters can be confused. We know exactly what module modifiers belong to. So as opposed to this example, person hand dot left. What's dot left? Like I have no idea where dot left came from. If I'm going to develop a variation on person hand, or maybe person, I don't know. I don't know if I need left. If I want left, I don't know where to get it. So you can create some pretty complex modules with nesting and without really creating ambiguity because all the classes are telling you where they belong. There's a lot of clarity with BEM. Here's another example, which you probably can't see because it's super small. I'll post some of these slides maybe a little bit later, but basically this just shows you can have a masthead module. It has a variation. We have nested modules within it. And then just kind of by looking through this, every class on here I can tell. But I can tell what module it belongs to and what it's contributing. And if I want to use part of this, I know how to do that. This is another example that Reveal.js kind of messed up. So I'm going to skip that one. Here's a common sort of argument, reaction to BEM is that it's pretty verbose, and why not just do this kind of more simple situation here. So the reason is search input space dot full. I don't really know what full is. It's not giving me any information. Yeah, I can't really use that with confidence if I have to jump in later. Whereas site search dash dash full, it's pretty darn clear what's going on there. But there are some problems with BEM. Not everything is a block. Most things are blocks, which is why BEM.dat dropped the block prefix, but not everything is a block. We have things like utility classes, layout classes, theme variations, JavaScript binding, modifiers, and also modifiers and state aren't really the same thing, right? We have variation of a module, but that's not the same as a state of a module like collapsed. So there are some issues. There are some blind spots here, but kind of comparing BEM to, or comparing really all these styles to some of the criteria I mentioned earlier, minus the ID. BEM fits pretty much the best, right? So it really facilitates reuse by providing clarity and transparency and and creating a lot of self-documenting code. We can really know with confidence what we can and can't use in a document when we use this strategy, because we know where everything belongs and how it all fits together. So for a large project, this could reduce a lot of ambiguity and reduce a lot of the time that you would need to spend getting up to speed. So BEM fits mostly. There are a few problems with BEM, like I mentioned. Like not everything is a block. That is a big problem. And that's sort of the main problem with BEM that I've had and that other people have had with BEM. But I have been using BEM for the last little bit. Previously, I've been using SMAX, which seems to have been sort of like the default strategy for naming things. And this is what I've been doing. Basically, my block name dash element. This is sort of the strategy from SMAX. And I've been tacking on the BEM style modifier on the end of it. And the reason I've been doing this is because I figured keeping with something we've already been doing would sort of ease the transition to something more complicated like BEM. Turns out nobody that I talked to actually opposed trying out BEM. So there's no benefit of using my bizarro Frankenstein syntax to ease the transition that no one really is hesitant to you doing anyway. This is also my own syntax. No one else was writing code that looked like this, which is an immediate disadvantage because when you're the only person in the industry that's writing in a certain way, you're kind of cutting yourself off from a bit of discourse. and you're losing a lot of community learning that you can gain. So yeah, this isn't particularly great. Part of it is around my use of the underscore. I've been using underscores in place of spaces because every single language that exists that I'm aware of that doesn't use camel case does this. This is an extremely widespread pattern, except for CSS, where CSS seems to do a dash for space as convention. And so my kind of stubbornness with that is a bit problematic because it's inconsistent with Compass, which is the framework that we use. It's really large. It's obsoleted by normal BEM syntax, which gives us more information using different indicators. It's really confusing in file names, and there's really no advantage to having a syntax that's all your own. So anyway, that's a couple of the issues that I've run up with that sort of homegrown BEM syntax. But I think I've arrived at something that is pretty great. Sort of a bit of a hybrid approach, taking some of the stuff from BEM, some of the stuff from SMAX. So drum roll looks like this.
That was the drum roll.
That was the drum roll.
Okay.
I mean, with audio, it would be a little bit more clear. You can imagine that if you were to hear the sound being produced,
There we go. That's what we're missing.
sounds like a drum roll. So this is where I've landed. Conventional BEM syntax, which is really ugly and conveys a whole ton of information, as well as the sort of SMAX namespace. So the issue that I had with BEM was that I was missing things that weren't blocks. The SMAX namespace fills those gaps in, which is fantastic. Here's another example, which you probably also can't read because it's very tiny. But this is an example of a layout or sort of a partial that uses BEM for some modules. You can see, so site name has a variation called Christmas, because that's my favorite holiday. And the header also has a variation called Christmas. And there's no ambiguity here. I can have modules with variations of the exact same name, and that's totally fine because I know which module they belong to. I can use utility classes, and I know where they're defined because the prefix is telling me that. This primary nav is collapsed. I know that collapsed, is a state, probably changed with JavaScript. Maybe this JavaScript right here. I know I have a class specific for that I can use elsewhere. So this piece of code telling me tons of information. I don't have to read any documentation at all. I can just look at it. I know what's going on. Here's a layout using the L prefix that I mentioned from SMAX. So I'm not using any IDs at all. I know which classes are layout classes, which ones are modules. It also means that if I do have an ID, I know that this main content that's probably used for linking, with like a skip link or something of the sort. You definitely can't read that. That's really small. I apologize. Anyway, so that's kind of what I've been playing with as a style. A couple concerns about this is that it's ugly. Totally. It's super, super, super ugly. At first, you look at it, and it's pretty ugly. Fortunately, it's totally okay for your front-end code to be aesthetically displeasing as long as it conveys a lot of information, which this does. It's complicated, which I also can't argue. Fortunately, we're professionals, so we can do complicated things. Go team. There's much more typing involved, which is true and not true. It's true in your HTML. You're going to be typing more classes. You can use things like Emmet to help you type more markup in less time. But really, be glad that you don't have tendonitis and suffer searing pain in both your arms like I do from typing. So it could be worse. It could be a lot worse. I've heard people complain that this is hard to grep for, which is true. You're used to grabbing a class name from the inspector, doing a grep for that in your style sheet, and if you do that, you might not find it because of how some Compass stuff works. So there'll be an adjustment because you're gonna have to grep a little bit differently for this kind of thing, and it's a new thing to learn. Totally true. Will be a bit of adjustment for everyone, myself included. I've added a few files in the SAS boilerplate that we have to kind of accommodate utility classes and layout classes. So if you see an L prefix or a U prefix, you know exactly where those go. And I've added a few naming conventions here, as well as messing up the reveal.js requirement for fancy slides. So that one just leaped out, so I'll start with that one. A couple other guidelines here are, we don't really want to style based on context. We want to create variations. So we have a module that looks a certain way. If it looks a certain way in a sidebar, that's probably a variation of the module, not styled based on being in the sidebar. We don't want to use tag names unless we absolutely have to, except in base.scss, which I mentioned from SMAX, was the unclassed element names. But not styling element names means that we can change our markup at any time to be something more semantic if we want to, without breaking our style sheets. Use full words in your class names, so instead of food, maybe a folder. Or field, whatever the case may be. Button, use the word button, not BTN. We want to convey as much information as possible, and don't want to have to buy a vowel to get there. We can nest quite a lot within SAS, and that's kind of like, when you start learning a preprocessor, they talk about nesting right away, and you get really carried away, and you write some really ugly code like what we talked about earlier. So don't really nest unless you need to. Don't nest too much, except for the ampersand and with media. And assume, when you're writing just a class name, that people are going to assume that to be a block. I alluded to the use of the ampersand earlier and why some of this stuff is hard to grep for. Here's an example of, this is probably Fed domain exclusive, little recap, a little behind the curtain for Fed interest here. So my top example, block element with the ampersand, and this shows how this compiles down below. So we want to use that as much as possible, as opposed to actually nesting the full class name in there, because we want to create as few levels of specificity as we can. I mentioned the issue with CSS and SMAX was that we need 2 levels of specificity all times. Sorry, not SMAX, just CSS. But the benefit here is we can get by with just 1 level of specificity because our class names are so well encapsulated. So you want to use that ampersand so we can get that really lean code. So in summary, this is the syntax for going. Block name is the name of our module, double underscore for an element, double dash for a modifier variation. And the prefixes is and has, maybe can and did as well for state. L for layout, U for utility, T for theme, JS for JS, added some new files. I'm going to skip this slide, which was rehashing some of those guidelines. Next steps is we need to document this a little bit better. The Fed Wiki has some updated information about this. So if you go there now, or the Dev Wiki, there's information about this style if you need a reference. Sassy Play will be updated with this. The library is going to be updated shortly, so that'll also serve as a reference. And next step, kick ass at CSS. I'll post some articles around, and thumbs up.
Awesome.
So,
Thanks,
anyone has any questions? Now is the time.
I have a couple of questions.
Hit me.
So first question, this may be a simple one. So when you're writing HTML, are you assuming that you're adding these classes to every single element as you add an element?
If you are writing markup and you are writing class names, then yeah, think about it. think about kind of how these fit together for sure.
But like even, I mean, if you're assuming that you're never styling elements, then you should almost just assume that every element needs a class anyways. No? Or do you only add the classes to the markup as you style them?
I would, so how I generally work is, I mean, if I'm doing an old school cut up a mock-up, build around kind of thing, I'll take my mock-up, write all my markup first, and then do style. So I'll write all my markup with my classes, my class names, and then I'll style it after. Yeah, so I'm not necessarily writing my class names as I'm writing my style sheets. If that answers the question.
Yeah, makes sense. Second question that I have is, and I think I may have actually thought through this in my head now, but in terms of sharing styles between modules, is there a way to do that, or do you essentially need to repeat styles for each individual module, or are they sub-modules essentially, or how does that work?
It depends on what you want to share.
So like for a button, for example, like a button link, how does that work?
Well, okay, so if you have a say a call to action box module and you have a button inside of that, you would have your call to action module, and you'd have a button module, and in your markup you would just put one module inside of another. Part of the advantage of this is that you can nest these modules as many layers deep as you want. Commonly, I'll have a module which is sort of like an item in a group of items, and then another module that is the group of items. So I might have like a grid item module or whatever, and then like a collection module. So you can nest them.
Cool, makes sense.
Or create a utility class if there's something that's shared.
Cool.
Any other questions, concerns? Andrew, are you deeply upset that I'm using a dash instead of an underscore? Anyone angry?
Jamie's looking pretty angry over here. Sorry, Jamie. Just kidding.
That's cool, Andrew. You can take as much time as you need. I believe what is there? Grieving and then anger, and I don't know how the whole structure works.
Denial.
Denial.
I have what might be a dumb question. How does this mesh with something like Drupal that injects a lot of its own CSS?
So Drupal can't have nice things. This is an ideal to strive for as much as possible. Drupal isn't an ideal to strive for. There are a lot of things like this that Drupal won't really allow. Yeah, when you're writing style sheets for Drupal, you're going to be dealing with a lot of classes, like field-specific classes, entity-specific classes. So as far as I know, using Drupal in your typical display suite way, you just can't do this, unfortunately, which means that when you are using Drupal, you're going to be writing a lot of code that you can't reuse and being unable to reuse code that's been previously written. Unless you do things all in the template, which is a less standard way, which is probably not an Aqueous certified way. So,
okay. So I was just going to say I was part of a team 2 or 3 years ago that was trying to standardize the way they write CSS, and they had such a difficult time doing it. Their solution was basically to come up with a long list of do this and don't do that, and it just wasn't working. And I'm really impressed with Nathan's solution because it's really elegant and it's just really a good way to go forward, and our whole team is excited about it. And I'm also I'm just stoked that Nathan is so on top of what's going on in the industry, and this is like cutting edge technology for CSS nerds. So yeah, this is really going to pay off big time for our code forwards.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good job, Nathan.
sweet. So if anyone runs into any blockers with this, feel free to give me a shout anytime if you're stuck. All of our new projects are going to use this. except for Drupal projects. Yeah, have a good rest of your day.
One question.
Yep.
I have a question actually. This might be a non-question, but so platforms like Twitter Bootstrap or Foundation, when I assume they started with a whole bunch of like classes and definitions. When you already have CSS, I guess, and stuff like that, do you kind of retrofit? Do you have kind of a version that is retrofitted, or like how do you approach that?
My honest answer is that Bootstrap and Foundation are for prototyping. Yeah. If you are basing a project on Foundation and Bootstrap, you are basing it on Foundation and Bootstrap, right? So you've got to buy in, right? In general, with any framework like that, if you're using them, you have to expect to be buying in fully. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting with it. If you try and BEM Bootstrap, you're going to be fighting quite a lot. So
and it wouldn't match any of the documentation, so it wouldn't make a ton of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, those frameworks, for sure, just for prototyping, I think. Unless, with some of the custom dev stuff, it's a little bit different in the admin interfaces. Yeah. So I guess just know that you're buying in. That's it.
With Drupal, I do wonder. We used to customize our markup in our classes and everything a fair bit to what we wanted to, and then we kind of embraced the idea that a Drupal markup sucks. We can it. It'll use shitty code, but it'll be quicker. I do wonder, especially with some of the library stuff that we're doing, and as that produces efficiency, whether it's worth it to look at that assumption again in Drupal of the value of the effort at this point in actually customizing the markup within Drupal, versus the assumption that we'll just use the markup and deal with the SRS.
Right. So if you go to that route, you can save some time by reusing CSS, but you're going to lose time in Drupal efficiency. Building with Display Suite and that whole workflow with Drupal is much more efficient, so your Drupal build is going to be faster, even if you lose savings. If you want to win time on both fronts, you can just use WordPress.
Hey Nathan.
Go.
What about new team members or contractors coming in? Maybe this is all kind of in the go, but is there anything we need to be doing there to kind of make entry into our way of operating easier?
Yeah, absolutely. Contractors, send them to the dev wiki. I'm also actually post actually no, there are quite a few articles I added there as well. So contractors should definitely be using this. There's some documentation there. Put them in contact with me. New hires. I would love if we hired a new Fed just to have a few days and be get all up to speed. But at very least, we should point them in the direction of the wiki and whatever other documentation that we write about this.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Sweet. How do I make this hangout no longer on air?
Hi. Thanks, Nathan.
Bye.
See you.